I'm Professor Bede Bidlack of the Theology Department, and it's my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. David Grumett. Before doing so, however, I'd like to take a few moments just to quickly thank all of the many parties that are responsible for this event. The Theology Department, the Council on Being Catholic and Benedictine, the 125th Anniversary Steering Committee for the College, and the University of Edinburgh. Dr. Grummet is a Chancellor's Fellow in Christian Ethics and Practical Theology in the University of Edinburgh. He is Secretary of the Society for the Study of Theology, which is like the CTSA for all the theologians out there. He's the Assistant Editor of Ecclesiology, a Fellow of the Higher Education Academy, and a member of the Association Internationale Henri de Lubac. He is the author of 3 books and editor of 2, and has written many articles and book chapters on theology and material practice and on the modern French Catholic theology, and is currently undertaking a major research project on Eucharist. Of these, the work that has been most helpful for my own research is Teilhard de Chardin, Theology, Humanity, and Cosmos, where he places Teilhard within the Catholic philosophical and theological tradition. He's not as much of a maverick as I think a lot of people imagine him to be. The Jesuit David Ayot refers to this book of David's as being the most influential and most important book on Teilhard in the past 30 years, and I agree with that assessment. So Dr. Grummet will speak for about 35 or 40 minutes, which will leave us some time for questions and answers before we conclude at 5 o'clock. At 5 o'clock, I would invite you to some coffee out in the lobby where we can continue discussion and where you can ask that, you can grab David for that final question on Teilhard, on St. Benedict, or what will happen to Scotland Yard if Scotland votes for independence. Right? So, but do grab him shortly after the talk, because at 5:15 I need to whisk him away for a dinner with our theology students. So this is a shout out for any student who's interested in the Theology Society. Do see James Leonard in the back. Stand up, Jimmy. He's our Theology Society president, and he'll be happy to give you the pertinent information. So without any further ado, I give you David Grummet.
Well, thanks, Bede, for your extremely generous introduction, and thank you to everyone for the warm welcome to St. Anselm's today. It's been really nice just walking around and getting a flavour of the place and really being welcomed very warmly wherever I've been. So thank you so much. In my lecture this afternoon, I'd like to introduce 2 figures who've made large impacts on our thinking about spirituality today. The first is St. Benedict, there on the left-hand side. I say introduce, however, in a college with a Benedictine foundation, few, I'm sure, will be unfamiliar with the basics, at least, of his vision. The other figure, however, on the right, is Pierre Tr De Chardin. He was a French Jesuit born in 1881 and who died in 1955. Some here will know Teilhard because he was really popular in the 1960s and 70s. To others, however, he's probably a new name. So first of all, to Benedict, who was born in around the year 480. As many will know, he lived his whole life in Italy and grew up in Nursia, a small town about 100 miles north of Rome in Umbria. Benedict liked the countryside, understandably, as we can see. However, he had pushy parents. When he was 14, they sent him to Rome, which even back then was a metropolis for education in the liberal arts, a bit like the new students arriving here at St. Anselm's to commence studies. However, Benedict hated the big city and fled to the mountains east of Rome to Subiaco. He lived there in a cave as a hermit, then founded an abbey with a group of small communities of monks clustered around it. So Benedict, it seems to me, felt a deep bond with nature. For him, the physical givenness of a place provided the foundation for whatever spiritual life or observance might be lived out there. I'm obviously aware there are people in the room who know a lot more about Benedict than I do, so apologies if this is slightly summarised. Moving to Teilhard, though, he had a similar sense of the power of the natural world. He was born in 1881 in the town of Clermont-Ferrand in the Auvergne. The landscape of this part of central France was formed by craters of extinct volcanoes, known as puits, and this landscape made a deep impact on Teilhard, even as a child. Here we have the Puy de Pariou that really does look like a volcano, with the even better known Puy de Dôme behind it. Teilhard was fascinated by geology and by basic physical stuff, and those adult interests really do begin here in his earliest years. Indeed, he later recognised he became over-passionate about matter and didn't give enough attention to the spiritual principles that shape and organise it. He corrected this fault partly by developing his work with fossils, known as Paleontology. The importance of fossils for Teilhard was that they represented literally the history of life on Earth. Fossils weren't simply dead, static rocks. Rather, they represented an organised, developing life force produced by some kind of higher convergent power, even a divine power, we might say. However, neither Teilhard nor Benedict were content to spend their lives simply contemplating nature. Both were very much also concerned with the human world and wanted to rebuild community. Benedict was born just 4 years after the abdication of Romulus Augustus, the last Roman emperor, following a military revolt. The Senate had voted to send the Roman imperial regalia to the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, and it's from these events that the start of the Dark Ages, so-called, is usually dated. Anyway, as Benedict grew up, there was a sense that old power and grandeur of an empire had passed away. Local kings ruled, the Ostrogoths, who weren't as committed to Christianity as the emperors had been in the golden days of the Christian emperor Constantine. At least this was the story presented. People were being killed in the wars that were being fought, and there were shortages of food and money. Then the Ostrogoths were defeated by the armies of Justinian, the Byzantine emperor, and he tried to impose a high level of control over Christian beliefs and church life from faraway Constantinople. So there was this sense that the local church in Benedict's region was under oppression in a range of ways from both political and church authorities. Teilhard also lived in a time of political and social upheaval. Although he was French, he couldn't continue his Jesuit formation in France because of the exile of religious teaching communities during the Third Republic. Instead, he was sent abroad for this to England, particularly to Hastings and to Jersey, one of the Channel Islands. Then the First World War intervened and he was conscripted into the French army. Priests and members of religious orders received no exemption from the draft in most European countries, and Teilhard worked as a stretcher bearer. However, as we know only too well, the First World War tragically didn't end war in Europe. It didn't bring peace to Europe. Rather, atheist ideologies gained ascendancy, communism in Russia and Nazism in Germany, with Nazi aggression starting the Second World War. And here we have a fairly rare colour picture of a Nazi rally. You can see, obviously, the swastika banners on the left-hand side, a Celtic symbol, but which was appropriated by the Nazi regime for their political purposes. Teilhard was aware that these weren't merely political events, though, separate from questions of Christian belief. Also, Henri de Lubac recognised similarly that these events were a symptom of a crisis in Europe that was primarily spiritual. It wasn't simply a political crisis. Teilhard saw Nazism as the resurgence of a pre-human evolutionary dynamic of supposed biological stratification and exclusion that was opposed to the truly human and Christian principles of differentiated unity and convergent association. So in broad historical perspective, Nazism marked the culmination of a long historical process of secularization that had started at least with the French Revolution, if not earlier, and continued through the 19th century when Christian monarchs in several European countries had been overthrown and secular republics had been set up in their place. Now this might be a bit confusing for a United States audience, because here you obviously have a secular constitution and government underpinned by a strong Christian faith within civil society. However, within Europe, the dynamic has been different. There it seems that if you have a decline in Christian governance, you also have a decline in Christian belief and practice in society. Both Teilhard and Benedict saw that the appropriate response to the war and power politics within church and state wasn't to become involved in them. Rather, amid these kinds of chaos and dissolution, Christians are called to try to rebuild society according to the values of peace and harmony. For Benedict, this meant founding a distinctive community faithful to Christ, which he called a school of the Lord's service. At the very start of his rule, he deploys military metaphors, calling on his readers to renounce their own will and, in his words, fight for the true King, Christ, by taking up the strong and glorious weapons of obedience. So Benedict subverts the terms of secular conflict, putting them to Christian use. He does the same with obedience, refusing to be manipulated by secular rulers. In Pope Gregory the Great's dialogues, there's a story about the Ostrogoth king Totila, who we have here, or rather at this point we have someone impersonating him. The king tells Benedict that he'll come to see him, but instead sends his bodyguard dressed up with him, that figure there in the tunic. The aim is to trick Benedict and make him look silly. However, the holy man realizes that this is actually an attempt to trick him, and we see him here seated in his chair, gesturing towards the impostor. Benedict realizes what's going on. The king himself then comes to apologize to Benedict. Here we have him kneeling before him, asking his forgiveness. And the king acknowledges Benedict as a prophet. These images, by the way, are from frescoes in Florence, in Italy, the sacristy of San Miniato al Monte. This is part of a long series of frescoes on the life of Benedict that some here, I'm sure, are familiar with. Teilhard also refused to pursue his ends by accepting the oppositions of combat and politics that the world presented to him, or trying to fight against them on their own terms. In the First World War, he served as a stretcher bearer rather than, like many other priests, as a soldier or officer. People might have thought that in the First World War the priests and members of religious orders all served as chaplains. However, there were a lot of these people, and as I said, they were conscripted. So actually, the French army didn't need as many chaplains, or anything like as many chaplains, as there were clergy and religious who were conscripted into the war effort. So Teilhard is this person here on the right-hand end. Rather unusual picture of him with facial hair. He normally shaved, but obviously in the war sartorial elegance and appearance declined a bit. Serving as a stretcher bearer exposed Teilhard to even greater danger, though, probably, than if he'd been a normal soldier or an officer, because the stretcher bearers had to run out to collect the dying and injured from the battlefield. Their life expectancy was often measured in weeks, but Teilhard somehow survived the war and was cited several times for bravery. Neither did he seek a re-Christianization of Europe according to the terms of the old order, such as by promoting the church as a secular political power, even though this remained a possibility, at least in theory, until as late as the Lateran Treaty of 1926. It was only then, really, that the Roman Catholic Church and the fairly new state of Italy reconciled themselves to the political boundaries that now exist, with the Pope and the Church still having a small geographical state, the Vatican, but giving up what had been their much more extensive northern Italian territories. So rather than sort of harking back to that agenda, Teilhard called people to recognise that Christ governs the world at a higher level, not primarily via church authorities or the secular powers, but through being the centre of the convergence of all life, whether that's social life, political life, scientific life and Christian life, ordering these and bringing them together into a harmony and a unity. So we see both Benedict and Teilhard promote community, even if in different forms. For Benedict, community, as we well know, is local, indeed, in the first instance, very local. When we think of a Benedictine monastery in European context, some of the great medieval abbeys like Canterbury or Chartres might come to mind. However, Benedict probably intended his rule to be for a strictly limited number of monks in one place, maybe around 12, the number of the apostles. This was certainly the case at Subiaco. Only later at Monte Cassino did he found a larger community with all the monks together in a single complex. Even so, Monte Cassino remained a single community in one place. Moreover, as the Benedictine order grew, monks weren't free to circulate from one monastery to another, and as we well know, this remains the case today. Rather, when a monk was formally received into the monastery, they're required to promise stability and recognise they're no longer free simply to leave and travel around. Teilhard, however, being a Jesuit, understood community on the face of it very differently. Jesuits have famously been free with the permission of their superior to travel wherever their work sends them, whether that's mission, scientific research or helping the poor. Teilhard himself was born in France, formed as a Jesuit in England, spent many years in China where he completed important research into fossils, and he passed his final years in New York. In his letters he evokes the roots and destinations of a past age, packet steamers from Marseille to Alexandria, then onwards to Tientsin, via Suez, Aden and the Horn of India, the Trans-Siberian Railway from Paris to Peking, going through Moscow and the Gobi Desert, transatlantic liners crossing from Le Havre to New York in the final years before scheduled commercial flights. If you read his letters, he's a real globetrotter by the standards of his age. However, perhaps because he spread his life across all of the Northern Hemisphere's 3 continents, he perceived the world's finitude. Here we have one of the very early photos of the whole planet Earth, taken from space by the ATS-3 satellite that NASA ran from 1967 until as late as 2001. We take such images for granted nowadays, don't we? Particularly people of my generation. But it's important to realise that as recently as 50 years ago, no one had ever seen a photo of the whole globe. They simply didn't exist. Moreover, no such photos were taken during Teilhard's lifetime. He died in 1955, as I said earlier. Yet he anticipated with incredible prescience the new awareness of the Earth as a single whole to which these photos have since contributed. He saw increased ease of travel and communications, combined with rises in global population as shrinking the Earth. He'd surely have approved recent developments like email and iPhones. Indeed, he's rightly been called a prophet of the internet, describing a single gigantic network girdling the Earth. In 1947, in The Future of Man, he wrote, "No one can deny that a network, a world network of economic and psychic affiliations is being woven at ever-increasing speed, which envelops and constantly permeates more deeply within each one of us. With every day that passes, it becomes a little more impossible for us to act or think otherwise than collectively." Now, this might seem a long way removed from the kinds of collective action and thought that occur within a single Benedictine community. However, I suggest, and some people might disagree with this, but I suggest there is in fact some continuity. Teilhard was convinced that the Earth's surface imposed finite boundaries beyond which human life couldn't move due to technological and biological constraints. He was also sceptical about life on other planets, arguing that if such life existed, it would have contacted us by now. For Teilhard, the whole planet Earth is like a monastery, or maybe we might say like a college, setting bounds to our existence within which we must work on living together in cooperation for the common good. This living together, he thinks, is entirely possible and completely desirable. He thought that the socialization pressures across national, ethnic and religious divisions were ultimately irresistible. Of course there'll be attempts to establish ghettos or exclude people who are different, but because these go against the current of global socialization and convergence, they won't be in any group's interest. We should of course be alert to the problems globalization can cause. For example, mobile communications can be used for both good and bad. A cell phone, say, can be used by a third world farmer to cut out the middleman and gain a good price for his crops. It can also be used to detonate a bomb that kills and maims. We can use a cell to communicate with friends and family, or to play electronic games in pointless isolation. However, for Teilhard, true globalization is always towards greater convergence, respect for the other, complexity, deeper relationships, and increased sensitivity. One might think from Teilhard, just reading him in brief, that he's kind of baptizing almost any kind of development or globalization, but he really does have what I would call a kind of metaphysics of unification, which privileges particular values, those values I've just listed, such as respect for the other and deepening of relationships. So this socialization, this convergence, requires some kind of principle to guide and govern it. For both Benedict and Teilhard, such a principle was embodied in the headship of a governing authority figure to whom obedience was due. In Benedict's rule, obedience was owed to the abbot. Indeed, for Benedict, the abbot's role was so important that it formed the second chapter of his rule. Benedict was, of course, himself his community's abbot, and here we see him with his staff, symbolizing pastoral authority. I think I'm right in saying that the staff being turned with the crook inwards signifies jurisdiction within a particular community, whereas if the staff was pointed more forwards or outwards, that would suggest jurisdiction across a wider area, such as a bishop of a diocese might exercise. The abbot was expected to rule his disciples by word and example, treating everyone fairly and rewarding only good works and humility. He needed to adapt himself to circumstances, humouring, rebuking and persuading as each person's disposition required. He had to display both love and rigour, sternly rebuking the undisciplined and even using corporal punishment on the bold, hard and proud. I'm aware that there has been some evolution in the interpretation of the rule since its compilation. The meek, patient and gentle, however, were to be exhorted verbally. Benedict called for obedience without delay, instructing his monks to receive an order from their superior as a divine command, without half-measure, complaint or objection. He wrote in chapter 5 of his rule that, immediately abandoning their own affairs and forsaking their own will, dropping the work they were engaged on and leaving it unfinished, monks should with swift obedience follow up with their deeds the voice of him who commands them. And almost in the same moment of time that the master's order is issued, is the disciples' work completed, in the swiftness of the fear of the Lord, the two things being rapidly accomplished together by those who are impelled by the desire of attaining life everlasting. As a Jesuit, Teilhard was also under authority. This rare photo shows Vladimir Ledochowski, who was Jesuit Superior General during much of Teilhard's adult life and one of the longest-serving generals in the Society's history. Teilhard suffered deeply, as some will know, for his views on evolution, especially because these impinged on the doctrine of original sin and on the idea that Adam and Eve were the prototypical human beings from whom all others were descended. Writing to a non-Catholic friend, Teilhard nevertheless recognized his own incompetence to judge the Church, which he described as channeling the lifeblood of souls such that he would feel, in his words, guilty of disloyalty to life if I tried to free myself from so organic a current as the Church provides. He realized that ultimately nothing outside of the Church satisfied his inclinations and hopes. The Church remained for him the best earthly approximation to the truth despite its deficiencies. Teilhard wrote, "The Church possesses and transmits from century to century a view of Christ, an experience of Christ, a way of living Christ, whose definitive form and whose richness she is unable at any given moment to express completely." So Teilhard, like Benedict, viewed obedience as the concrete correlate of freedom. Obedience freed the monk from daily repetitive drudgery by leaving open at any moment the possibility of new tasks. For Teilhard, it connected the believer, and in his case the Jesuit, into a global, vital spiritual current that opened the possibilities of development and change, geographical mobility, and ever-new spiritual apperception of the world. Following obedience, another striking similarity between Benedict and Teilhard is their high valuation of work, which I've been talking about with a couple of people today. Benedict instructs his monks to look upon all the utensils of the monastery and its whole property as upon the sacred vessels of the altar. And this is a very powerful instruction to me as someone who is in no way a member of a Benedictine community. The monk and maybe other faithful people aren't to neglect anything nor be wasteful or greedy. A striking dimension of the Benedictine rule is that every monk was and is required to undertake manual labour on a daily basis. Even those who in Benedict's time had come from noble families and would have had servants to do their dirty work for them in those families. This painting here is titled Laborare Estorare, to work is to pray, and it's by the English artist John Rogers Herbert, a beautiful piece of art in my view. All the monks would have been helping till the fields, irrigate the crops, harvest corn, tend the garden, cook food, buss tables, clean rooms, and so on. It's therefore quite proper, it seems to me, that St Anselm's today provides opportunities for students' professional and career preparation. In the Benedictine tradition, work is linked with study and with prayer and worship, flowing out of them and feeding back into them. Teilhard also promoted a strong belief in the dignity of all kinds of work. In his spiritual classic, The Divine Milieu, he questions what he saw as a tendency in interwar spiritual direction to devalue work's material products and focus on the spiritual motivations for the action behind the work. But Teilhard's wanting to say it's not just our spiritual motivation that's important, it's the actual products of the action, it's the actual physical stuff and the realities that we transform through our work and labour that are important too. Action can't be judged solely in terms of the intention underlying it, as if the world is no more than a training ground for spiritual virtue. Our productive efforts aren't merely games played for spiritual exercise. Rather, Teilhard insists all faithful work is a cooperation in the work of Christ, by which the world is gradually completed according to Christ's purpose. He refers to a communion through action, in which Christ penetrates our creaturely energies. In action, Teilhard says, we adhere to God's creative power, coinciding with it and becoming its living extension, uniting ourselves with God through a shared will and a shared end. Teilhard writes, our work appears to us above all, as a way of earning our daily bread. But its essential virtue is on a higher plane. Through it we complete in ourselves the subject of the divine union. And through it again we somehow make to grow in stature the divine term of the one with whom we are united, our Lord Jesus Christ. Consequently, whatever our human role may be, whether we are artists, workers, or scholars, we can, if we are Christians, speed towards the object of our work as though towards an opening onto the supreme fulfillment of our beings. A pretty high statement of the spiritual value of work there. This quote, though, might make it sound like our work is solely to do with us and our own fulfillment and well-being. But work is also, Teilhard makes clear, a site of encounter with God. He writes that God awaits us every instant in our action, in the work of the moment. He is at the tip of my pen, my spade, my brush, my needle. Now we might add my mouse, my keyboard, my electronic pointer, and so on, of my heart and of my mind. By pressing the stroke, the line or the stitch on which I'm engaged, to its ultimate natural finish, I shall lay hold of this last end towards which my most interior will tends. So work isn't a spiritual encumbrance or a distraction from Christian devotion. Rather, by their work, Christians live in the world, contributing to its natural progress and fulfillment. So we could even see work as sort of part of the historical developmental process of the world. Teilhard, as people will well know, was very focused through his life on reflecting on how evolution, how biological evolution is somehow sort of directed by Christ. For Teilhard, evolution isn't simply a random process, although the mechanism of it is random. Nevertheless, particularly in evolution's human phase, there develops a convergent, teleological, purposeful dimension to evolution, such that we are where we are now, not just through chance, but because there has been some kind of divine providence at work. That's not to say that there isn't this Darwinian random driver to evolution, but that randomness is somehow channeled through particular pathways, so that we are where we are today. There may well not have been time, he and some other scientists have argued, for all the sort of random dead ends to be explored and ruled out in order for human life to be where it is today. So development for Teilhard is partly this sort of biological evolution, but it's just as much, since humans have come on the scene, what we do through our work, and actually how we almost transform evolution. If we think about morally difficult things today, such as sort of genetic engineering, there is a sense that we are taking control of our own evolution today through our work and our action, and actually directing our own history in a way that is qualitatively different from the past. So work is blending with evolution, really, as Teilhard sees it. The final point of similarity between Benedict and Teilhard I'd like to draw out is their common focus on Christ, and this is surely a good place to end. In the monastery, the abbot shared in the authority of Christ. This didn't mean only that his position was raised above what it would otherwise be, but that all his actions were subject to the approval of Christ as the abbot's own superior. The abbot was not to teach or ordain or command anything which is against the law of the Lord, being subject to the future dread judgment of God, as Benedict puts it. Teilhard also located all human actions and other earthly events, like the evolution of complex biological organisms, within the context of Christ's providential action and judgment, ultimately. Teilhard was especially inspired by the biblical imagery of the cosmic Christ ruling over the created order, governing and sustaining it. And if you look closely, you have the Alpha and the Omega there, the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet, symbolizing or signifying Christ as the first and the last of creation. So Christ was a supreme centre for Teilhard of convergence and consistence, in which everything is knit and holds together. Especially striking is a gloss of Teilhard's that combines at least 4 scriptural passages in which Teilhard praises Christ as the Alpha and the Omega, the principle and the end, the foundation stone and the keystone, the plenitude and the plenifier. He is the one who consummates all things and gives them their consistence. It is towards him and through him, the inner life and light of the world, that the universal convergence of all created spirit is effected in sweat and tears. He is the single centre, precious and consistent, who glitters at the summit that is to crown the world. Really sort of poetic biblical glossing there. People have sometimes thought that Teilhard makes Christ a mere function of human activity and biological development. However, I hope I've managed to convince you that actually he posits an inverse relationship. Rather, it's Christ who governs and completes everything that happens on earth, whether that's biological evolution or whether it's human work. So let me conclude. Neither Teilhard nor Benedict could have imagined the fame they'd acquire after their deaths. Given how well known both of them now are, it's important to understand how their ideas relate and realise how much they share in common. Teilhard could be viewed as offering a modern, globalised version of Benedictinism. I don't want to go that far, however. Teilhard and Benedict embrace different kinds of community, with Benedict focused on the local and Teilhard on the surrounding panorama. Yet in the present world we're acutely aware that the local can't exist in isolation from the wider world. Even Benedict's monastery depended on wider society for food and other provisions, and was continually disrupted by the arrival of guests who were to be received as if Christ himself. Teilhard, for his part, fully accepted that the corollary of true global convergence was increasing complexity. In other words, by complexity, I mean local connections and communities becoming stronger, not weaker, in an era shaped by the internet and other global communications. Maybe Teilhard didn't stress this aspect enough in his writing. He was very much excited by the big picture, but I think it's there, and it's certainly there if you sort of push the logic of his thought to its conclusion. Both Benedict and Teilhard, though, dedicated themselves to a lifelong pursuit of the truth, so it's appropriate we call them to mind together today. Thank you very much. And perhaps this would be an appropriate moment for me to acknowledge that I am aware that I'm speaking to several members of the Benedictine order, and including, I think, to an abbot. A couple of abbots, oh goodness. So I hope my sort of statements and appraisals as an outsider to that haven't been sort of too presumptive. I very much like to have people's feedback on that and the connections I've made.
So with that, instead of it being as much of a Q&A type of an atmosphere, do engage in discussion with Dave. I think that's what you're welcoming.
Yeah.
And do you want me to moderate, or do you want to field your own question?
Why don't you moderate it, as you know the people?
Okay, sure. Who would like to do it? Yes.
Enjoyed the talk. Can you say something about, since you brought in questions about his labor, can you say something about his experience as a paleontologist doing field work? Is there anything that you could take as a specific example that might be an illustration of where that contributed to his understanding of this cosmic relations that you talked about?
Well, Teilhard himself didn't spend a huge amount of time doing sort of everyday manual work. I mean, his version of work was a bit more glamorous and exciting, kind of travelling to dig up fossils, although I imagine that kind of work involves long periods, days, weeks, of just kind of digging around in the dust. I'm not really clear to what extent he did that work himself, and other Jesuits in China did that work themselves, or if they employed locals to do the digging, but I'm sure there was a fair bit of drudgery there. I mean, I guess for him, his work was research, so there was a strong element there of the sense that the development is a development in knowledge and understanding. So that is sort of the contribution of research to the sort of material and spiritual development of the world. Though he wouldn't be saying that that's sort of the only kind of labour that should be privileged above others. I think he would very much see sort of ordinary manual labour, like the chap sweeping the car park, as also just as much cooperating in the work of Christ. He's not an intellectualist in that sense. It's not just through our reasoning that we are sort of participating in the divine in some way. It is through the actual physicality of our work, whatever that may be.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much. It seemed to me that you were suggesting that the difference between Benedictine and Teilhardian views of community is a sense of scale. And I was wondering if there were a difference in how communities function and how the divine functions in ingression into those communities and guides it when you start to increase in scale in the mode, the mechanism by which the community is bound together, moves from face to face to digital or other means of interconnection. Is it a gradual transition, or is there a difference in kind as you move from smaller communities to larger communities?
That's a really good question, because as we well know from history, Jesuits have been fabulously difficult to govern at times. I mean, they're sort of travelling all over the place, doing all kinds of things, whereas if you have people within a particular local community, it's much easier to sort of know what people are doing. I guess there is, yes, in governance at an institutional level is a lot more difficult the bigger one gets. So I guess Teilhard, although he is not rejecting the obedience of the Church, contrary to what has sometimes been claimed, he is depending more on a kind of direct divine governance of the world. So that when we act, when we do things, when we work, we need to try to discern what is right and what works and what contributes to the true development of the world. So yes, that does increase risk, I guess, but that is modern life. I mean, he was very excited in what now seems a rather idealistic way about the United Nations. He did in principle believe in global governance, and that was one of the reasons he remained passionately committed to the Roman Catholic Church through his life, because that is the only church in the world that has a serious global institutional basis. And he also hoped that, I suppose, that sort of model would be developed for secular political governance too. So he'd be sort of very dismayed at the sort of ineffectiveness of the United Nations as it's developed since his death.
Sister Marie?
I have a comment, not a question. I was very moved by knowing how much of a challenge his thoughts were at his time, during his lifetime, and knowing that he probably was somewhat disciplined or chastised for his thinking. He still opted to accept the church as the place where it was, though imperfect, it was the place where, however you I would like to get a quote on that, but you used to quote that it was the most perfect place in order, here on earth, in order for it to be a conduit for this kind of organization or whatever. But it reminded me of a lot of theologians, especially around his time, and I wonder if it would be the way today. I'm not quite sure, but when you think of the theologians like Yves Congar or Armin de Lubac or Chenu, those people were all also silenced and took their discipline in a very humble way. I mean, in that regard, among other things that they've done for us, they give us a great example, I think. And I just learned now that AR is also an example of that kind of churchman, which I appreciated hearing.
Yes, thank you. And so Teilhard was disciplined earlier than those folks. I mean, he was, this is around the mid-1920s that he really got into trouble. But as you well know, people like de Lubac, it was around the time of Humani Generis and into the 1950s that restrictions were placed on what they could write and publish.
But even before that, the philosopher Edouard Louvois, who was influential in Teilhard, really taught him that lesson. It's like as far as you can go with your thought, in the end you have to be obedient to the church.
Yes.
Yes, please call.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grumett. My name is Nicole Flores, and I'm a professor in the theology department here at St. Anselm College. And I was also struck by a similar theme that Sister Maureen pointed out, and that's the theme of obedience and disobedience here. And what I think you said is obedience as a concrete correlative of freedom, and that statement is really compelling to me. But I'm wondering if you can reflect a little bit and try to fit disobedience within that matrix. And now I feel like I'm anathema for saying that in a community that's dedicated to obedience in a lot of meaningful ways. But by disobedience, I don't mean that just disobeying a rule of an instructor, but perhaps something along the lines of civil disobedience. How would that fit with what you're saying about the relationship between obedience and freedom?
Yes, I need to think about that for a few seconds. I guess there's a sort of dogmatic obedience that can develop in the way some people behave. I'm just talking about life in general, not within a monastery or a college or anything specifically, but there is a sort of literalism of obedience, I think, that becomes almost sort of self-defeating, sort of following the letter every time. So maybe one, within the context of obedience, one could understand civil disobedience or other forms of disobedience as actually being obedience potentially to a higher principle or value that the sort of literal rules are intended to promote. Now, I'm not saying that every action is really just a form of obedience. Clearly it isn't. And you have, it seems to me that really we're still trying to come to terms with the 68er Bewegung, the wave of 1968, and how people like Pope Benedict, who were identified as sort of liberals at the Second Vatican Council in broad terms, actually then saw the problems that sort of liberalism and new social movements could cause. So, in response to that they, and sort of de Lubac as well, for example, and other theologians, then became a bit more cautious and conservative in what they were recommending. So I guess this is a dialectic we're grappling with still. If anyone has a solution, let's hear it.
I'm curious about how other aspects of Teilhard's thought are working in the world today. I've noticed more references to him over the last few years, and I suppose I would associate him with neoclassical theism or panentheism, a turn towards a more organic rather than mechanical model of the cosmos. And he is making claims about, for example, the Earth would have a kind of unity greater than that of a pile or a heap. He has a noogenesis and Christogenesis. He seems to emphasize the divine immanence in a way that perhaps might have been present in some early Christian writings, but the divine transcendence has been on the ascendant since the late Middle Ages. Is his vision of the nature of being becoming more influential than before? Are churchmen warming up to that? Or is he, as I heard him referred to once, simply another, sort of the travesty of New Age thinking?
Well, obviously different people are reading him different ways, as we'd expect with any sort of well-known figure. Teilhard's works, as some will know, were not published during his lifetime. Teilhard was banned from publishing theology, and so all we have is a small number of very early studies that were published by him during his lifetime, specifically on theological topics. His main corpus was published after his death by literary executors, and there's a big committee that was got together. So he had no control over the order stuff was published in. The Phenomenon of Man was first published, Le Phénomène humain, and I think that sort of came to govern, or that became the governing hermeneutic of his thought, and this can be used very easily to promote a kind of sort of New Age immanentist pantheism, which I think was hugely unfortunate, because later on, what I would see as some really important, valuable works of theology and spirituality were published, particularly the Divine Milieu, the writings in Time of War, Heart of the Matter, Hymn of the Universe. So I think it's partly what people are reading that determines what they're saying about him. So what's going on at the moment? Well, I mentioned Pope Benedict, who, in the spirit of the liturgy and in some of his public comments, has been very affirming of Teilhard's liturgical theology, how he sees the Eucharist and the consecration that happens there as really sort of spreading outwards and becoming a wider consecration of the world and of matter, for instance. So that's one sort of area where Teilhard is being drawn on, and that would seem to promote a sort of transcendence in broad terms. Evolution, there's a little bit of a pushback now against the idea that evolution is purely random. Simon Conway Morris, an evolutionary paleobiologist in Cambridge, England, has been doing a huge research project on evolutionary convergence. So he's looking at how the same kinds of mutations seem to happen in unconnected evolutionary branches. So the camera eye, for instance, the eye being an incredibly complex organism, but one that has developed similarly, independently in different branches of evolution. So it's that kind of thing that Simon is using to suggest that convergence isn't just of a dream. There's actually a scientific basis for it, although that's disputed. And Simon likes Teilhard.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's some interest in Teilhard in sort of systems biology, but that doesn't really connect with theological concerns. And yes, there's always sort of discussion bubbling around about his alleged sort of New Age agenda, and that attracts both enthusiasts who say, yes, I'm a New Age person and Teilhard is one of my apostles. That and that also attracts heavy criticism from people who don't like the New Age agenda.
And likewise, transhumanists have also hijacked.
Yes.
And Sister De Leo answered that challenge, I think, quite well. President DeSong.
You've mentioned Pope Benedict a few times. I'm curious your thoughts on the influence that Teilhard may have had on Pope Francis.
That's a difficult one, thank you. I mean, Pope Francis is obviously very concerned, is he not, with the basic reality of things as he finds them, sort of being in local communities, sort of social action, political witness. He has had said one or two things that, in my hearing, could be applied as slightly critical of Teilhard, along the lines of sort of we shouldn't be concerned with sort of visions of global unity or abstract sort of theological, philosophical speculations. Rather, we should be engaged at a local level with concrete reality. So maybe Pope Francis isn't such an enthusiast on Teilhard as Pope Benedict, sadly for me.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
I wanted to go back to that area where you spoke about obedience. Isn't there a correlation between obedience and love?
Yes.
From what I've never really read his works, but I feel that perhaps he may have been called to be obedient to the church because of his love for the church.
Yes, and Teilhard was very much a person of love. He was a passionate person, and sort of wrote, particularly in some of his later works, about sort of love energy and love as the sort of premier form that energy takes among humans. So love as a unifying force, but nevertheless love between people as needing to be governed by some kind of principle outside people. He has 3 published wedding addresses, and he sort of says a similar thing in different ways in each of these addresses. He's talking about how the couple's love for each other will ultimately be dependent on and strengthened by a sense of a shared reality that is beyond them and ahead of them, i.e. faith in its very broadest terms. So love is about how we orient ourselves in the world, not about becoming, I'm not saying you're saying this, but it's not about sort of becoming overly self-enclosed in sort of 2 people between themselves sort of thing.
Thank you, David. That was wonderful. And the monastic community does remind me that it is 5 o'clock. It's like, off the office. And this serves as an introductory event to many upcoming events for our 125th celebration happening throughout the year. And do mark your calendars for September 26th. That's when the official kickoff for the 125th anniversary celebrations will take place. So in the meantime, enjoy some coffee and some refreshments and further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.